Hello, we're back. It's been a little while, but we've got lots of new podcast material coming for you over the next few weeks and months. For now, please enjoy an interview with the one and only James Wallis that we recorded over the summer. Welcome to the Tabletop Gaming Magazine podcast. I'm Chris Eggett, the editor of the magazine, and today I'm joined by the one and only James Wallis.
Good morning.
How are you doing, James?
Very well. Beautiful day. Having fun. Taking a break from work to do this. So everything fine.
Yeah. Thank you very much for taking the time. So today we're going to try and talk about a couple of things, but we're going to try and talk about game mechanics as a concept, because I think a lot of people outside the hobby, if they pick up the magazine, will mention mechanics that maybe they don't necessarily immediately understand, or they have to have a guess at, and then and usually they're right, to be honest, because they're quite self-descriptive. So we're just hopefully going to sort of enlighten people about what we're talking about when we talk about mechanics. So shall we start with the easy one, the broad one of what is a game mechanic?
It's a really good question. Among other things, I've been teaching people how to design board games for a number of years. And it's one of those questions like, what is a role-playing game? That, you know in your head what the answer is, but it's really difficult to express simply and concisely. The game mechanics are the principles and the little algorithms and systems that make games work, that you put together to make games work. Principles of play, the building blocks of play. There is, in fact, a book that came out last year called The Building Blocks of Tabletop Game Design, an Encyclopedia of Mechanisms by Jeff Engelstein and Isaac Shalev. I have no idea how to pronounce it. I'm going to pronounce it Shalev, though it may well be Shalev. And it's literally an encyclopedia of game mechanics, and it's aimed at academics, and it describes something like 130 different game mechanics and then breaks them down into kind of sub-mechanics and ways that they're used in different games. That's the theoretical version. In practice, you can take any game and break it down into its constituent mechanics. And some of these are ones that people talk about an awful lot, particularly in the current climate, like deck building, a deck building game where you start off with a small number of cards and add cards to that as the game goes on. Card drafting, which is a way of selecting the cards in your hand rather than just drawing randomly. Those are phrases that you'll read about an awful lot. But if you go back to the very simplest games like Ludo and Snakes and Ladders, you can break those down very simply into their constituent mechanics, some of which have very obvious names. Roll and move. You roll the dice, you move your piece. That's what a roll and move game is. And the moment you know the name of that, you can go, oh, well, there's so many other games that do that. Monopoly also does that. Cluedo does that. Many of the classic games are roll and move. Trivial Pursuit is a roll and move game. It's not. It's a trivia game. But it uses the roll and move mechanic. So people will say Snakes and Ladders is a roll and move game because that's the dominant mechanic. That's mostly what you do in the game. Other Snakes and Ladders mechanics, you've also got one that I don't think has a name, but play passing to the left. That's a game mechanic. It's one of the ways that you play a game. And you think, well, all games do that. Well, they don't. There are many other ways of play passing. People do everything simultaneously. People do stuff in real time. One of my games, Once Upon a Time, play passes to whoever interrupts the person who's currently speaking. It's not a universal. There are very few games mechanics that appear all the time. But play passing to the left is just one of those. It's almost just something that we do. And also in Snakes and Ladders, you've got I'm blanking on the name of this one. Basically, you land on a space and the space tells you what to do. In this case, if you land at the bottom of a ladder, you go up. If you land at the top of a snake, you go down. So the board determines what comes next. I mean, Snakes and Ladders is interesting because, for many reasons, but not least because there are no tactics in it at all. It's an entirely random game. You roll the dice, you do what the board tells you. It's all on the luck of the dice. And some people hate it for that reason, but small kids get a huge kick out of it. There is a little bit of magic in dice. So once you understand kind of the principle of, well, that's what a mechanic is, you can take any game and you can take it apart and go, okay, there's this bit and there's this bit and there's this bit. And once you know the names for the bits, and you don't have to drop £60 on the building blocks of tabletop game design. If you go to Board Game Geek, if you just Google Board Game Geek game mechanics, you will get their list of game mechanics with hyperlinks to little descriptions and the notable games that use those mechanics. And there's all kinds of stuff that you will have seen in a bunch of games, but you didn't know had a name, like modular boards. You put the board together in a different way. Settlers of Catan is the big example of that, but there's so many others. And different ways of playing the game. Dexterity games, where it's about your physical dexterity rather than necessarily skills and tactics. As I say, there's about 130 of these. A lot of them break down. The Building Blocks of Tabletop Game Design, the article I found most interesting. It is not a book that you would read for fun. I have to admit, it's very dry. But there's an article on auctions in games, auction components, and breaks down all the different ways that you can run an auction in games. So there's I think 13 or 16 different examples. If you are a games designer, if you're a games scholar, if you've just got a good games collection, it's really interesting. The level of scholarship in there is quite extraordinary. They clearly have massive, massive collections.
That sounds really good. You say you might not read it for fun. I might read it for fun. It sounds great.
It's the writing style is a little bit. It's interesting because Engelstein's done some other stuff that's a lot more. The writing is much more lively. This is a book. It's written for academics. It's written not exactly in academic ease. And I used to be a university lecturer, so this is a language I am more than familiar with. But this one, it has that dryness. It's written, I think, to be quoted in academic papers rather than it's a part of a toolkit for games designers.
What I like about talking about mechanics is kind of what happened there. As you listed things, my brain was going, yes, that one. I like that one. Because I find a mechanic that I haven't seen before or something I've not seen implemented in the way that it's implemented in the game. I then want to find every other game that does the same thing and just understand it as a set of things. I think that's why understanding mechanics is quite useful because it lets you know what you like.
Yes. Yeah. Yes, absolutely. I mean, just simply putting names to things is enormously powerful. I'm doing a talk about this, actually. There's a virtual Austrian games convention coming up in a couple of weeks where I've been invited to guest, which is to say that I will still be sitting in my shed. So there'll be a slightly longer delay on the recording. But yes, and I'm talking about the importance of naming stuff because I can blow my own trumpet here. Back in the mid-90s, myself and a friend, Andrew Rilston, he edited a magazine or almost an academic journal, except we weren't academics, called Interactive Fantasy, in which we were looking at basically how to break games down and how they work and what we call things. And games mechanics, there was some talk of this kind of thing and some names, but there was no real kind of methodology to it. It wasn't broken down. And for our second issue, a chap called Greg Kostikian, a name you may know, he's less of an active board game designer these days, but he was enormously notable in the 80s and 90s. In particular, he wrote the Paranoia RPG, he wrote the Star Wars RPG, and did an awful lot of notable work for SBI, and then went off and did some fantastic work in the early days of multiplayer online gaming. Enormously clever guy, and he did an article called I Have No Words and I Must Design towards a critical vocabulary, and he was basically saying what we need are terms to describe what it is that we do and how these things work. And various people tried to put vocabularies together and they didn't quite work at that point because we weren't quite sure what it was we were trying to describe. These days, we can break down any game mechanic, and the moment a new game mechanic appears, and they do not appear very often, the most notable example really is a few years back when Dominion came out, the first proper deck building game. It's not the first deck building game. Magic the Gathering is the first deck building game, but Magic the Gathering didn't put deck building front and center in what it did. Dominion is all about the process of building up your deck from cards, and the industry basically leapt on deck building as they had leapt on collectible card games 10 years or so previously with Magic. There was just this feeding frenzy, and now deck building is just part of the vocabulary of game design, and you can integrate it or not, or to a greater or lesser degree in your games. And the analogy I use too much is that game design is like being a cook, really. It's you're working with a finite pool of existing ingredients, which is what the game mechanics are, but you are combining them in different ways and in different orders and in different combinations, which, thanks to mathematics, that gives us an almost infinite possibility of new stuff that you can build into games. Collaborative games, cooperative games, where everyone's working together. This is not a new principle. I wrote a book with Ian Livingston last year, the year before, called Board Games in 100 Moves, and we tracked a bunch of things down. And most people think the first cooperative games were early 2000s or late 90s, and then people go, "Oh wait, what about Escape from Colditz, which isn't entirely cooperative, but has all the players acting as the Allied soldiers, except for one player who's a German." So actually, it's a one versus many game. But the early principles of co-op gaming is there. But then somebody pointed out there was a Thunderbirds game in the mid 60s that was everyone working together to to stop disasters destroying the world, or whatever it was. I have never seen a copy. It is apparently rubbish. This is not the same. No, this is not, we should say, the same as Matt Leacock's Thunderbirds game from a few years ago for Modiphius. It's interesting. You track this stuff back, and it goes, as I say, deck building did not start with Dominion. It started with Magic the Gathering, and probably someone's got an example earlier than that I'm not aware of. But back then, back in the 80s and the 90s, we were essentially working in the blind, working in the dark, because we didn't have names for these things, and we understood the principles almost on an organic level, but we didn't. It was very difficult to talk about them. It was very difficult to think about something if you don't have a name for it. If you can't, names kind of contain things and let you manipulate the concepts much more easily. I should just say, incidentally, if anyone's interested in interactive fantasy, all the copies are up for free on Drive-Thru RPG. You can download. We only did 4 issues because we were losing money on each one. But there is some really interesting stuff in there by some really great writers. Greg Stickin's Have No Words on Honest Design has gone on to become a modern classic. It's still out there. People, it appears on university syllabuses and stuff like that. Greg Stafford's in there. Jonathan Tweet, who was the lead writer, designer on Dungeons & Dragons 3rd edition. Loads and loads of good people.
I was just thinking, because you mentioning Magic the Gathering there, it's like, because now we wouldn't call Magic the Gathering deck building, would we? We might call it like deck construction.
Yes.
And that's because deck building kind of muscled in and sort of nudged it across. And it is this thing of like these broad terms get eaten by their more specific sort of children, basically.
Yes.
I think that's just trying to name these things at all. In terms of new stuff, new mechanics, I'm gonna show my massive ignorance now. I'm gonna have a guess at what the newest mechanic in gaming is, what it feels like, and I'm gonna be wrong. And I'm gonna say, is it Legacy?
I think Legacy is certainly the one that's hit fairly big. And I mean, is it a mechanic or simply kind of the way that you deal with the game? But the idea that elements of the game persist from session to session is, as far as I know, dates back to Rob Daviau and Risk Legacy, which is a monumental work, an extraordinary work. In fact, Hasbro, of all people, were prepared to take a risk like that on one of their crown jewels to do this genuinely astonishing leap forward in games design. The idea that you physically change, you physically alter the structure of the game each time you play it to turn it into something completely different. I'm not aware of any examples before Risk Legacy. I mean, I think there are smaller examples from that, and the one I talk about a lot. I talk about this game way too much. Wolfgang Warsch's The Mind,
of course,
which is a very simple game. It's basically a game of trying to play out a sequence of cards from 1 to 100 without talking to the other players. And it's hard to know exactly what the mechanic that's new in there is, but it makes me feel it gives me a sensation that I've never felt in games before as I play it. And this is also something I talk about too much. We do not have any terms or any vocabulary for the way that games make us feel, for the reactions that particular mechanics imbue on us. And we know that games mechanics and particular ones do cause us to feel in particular ways, because that's how the gambling industry works. Gambling has refined this to I'm not going to say art form, because it could be an art form, if so it's a very grubby one. But, you know, you look at free-to-play games, you look at, in particular, gambling apps on the internet, they are refined to within micromillimeters, nanometers, to optimize engagement and repetition and to keep you there throwing your money at this because it makes you feel in a particular way that you want to repeat. There's a lot less of that kind of thinking in board games, role-playing games, and tabletop gaming generally. I think Warhammer's got it. I don't know if they know they've got it. I think an awful lot of games kind of hit it by accident. And again, because we don't have these terms for talking about how games make us feel. The mind has that in spades. One of the things, the mechanics, I'm sure it's not new, but it's fairly new. Hanabi is the first one that I can think of, is not talking to the other players as you play. Playing in silence or not being able to discuss what is going on. But actually, as I've been saying that, most of the hidden information games, like Bridge is a team game in which you're not allowed to know what your partner's resources are. So it's the same principle there. So it's an old idea. It's just been tweaked. It's been tweaked and used in a different way. Yeah. I don't know. I'm not aware of... I can't think of anything that's really come through strong in the last 2 or 3 years that's created that kind of gold rush that a really good new mechanic sometimes does.
Speaking of how to describe the way we feel about games and also the mind, Asger, the designer of Copenhagen.
Oh yes,
he wrote in the magazine a couple of issues ago about the mind as his favourite game, and he described it as a dance. And he said it was like, because he felt like, you know, because you can't hear the other person and you're just communicating through looks and like just an understanding of the other person while doing something together. That may not be directly impacting each other, or well, we would be directly impacting each other, but like is not codependent on the other person actually understanding what you're about to do. It's about and like for him, and I think this is a thing that I try and articulate a lot, but I've obviously never felt that I've fully done it, which is the game is the bit that happens between the mechanics and the players, like in the air above the board.
Yes.
And I talk about it a lot when there's games which I feel have a scheme mechanic. If there's any game that feels like you all plan to do something horrible to each other and then get to act it out in some way, I feel that's that scheme mechanic. That's one that always gets me. I always think that feels great because you're forced into sort of this tactical thought in some way. Which again, similarly, another weird, I feel weird mechanic, but you're going to tell me probably has been around for 10,000 years, is the auction or action programming, which I first came across in Rurik, which is it's a Woro, I guess. So it's a area control Euro game with a map with little soldiers on it, and you control by majority in an area. You're trying to take over part of Eastern Europe in the 10th century, and it looks, there's a big board with loads of soldiers on it, and you look at that and you go, that's the game we're playing. But it's not. It's this tiny little board on the side, which is the action programming, where you place ranked advisors that not only have a value for how high up on that particular track they can go for you to take that action, and therefore it being a better action, but also they tell you what order you're going to do things in. So your lowest number is your the first thing you're going to do. So you have to do this like double backing of your plan, and again, all these things are things that happen. Plan ahead, and then you have this feeling over the table with the person you're playing against that you really are in this like struggle or conflict in some way, and yet there's no word to describe what that is.
No word yet.
Not yet. No. Well,
I think that's going to be one of the big leaps forward when we start to talk about this. And there are designers out there. There's the chap who did Fog of Love. I had a fascinating discussion with him a couple of years ago on this exact subject, and I think we're both kind of pushing things forward. And there's a bunch of other designers doing the same thing. But you're absolutely right. The board, so often, what's happening on it is not what's happening. It's a representation of what's happening, but the actual action is happening somewhere else. And, boards and components are increasingly pretty, increasingly gorgeous. I mean, you only have to look at Kickstarter to see what sells. It's the stuff that particularly looks good. Anything with loads of miniatures in it, or Azul, which is just gorgeous. But I had a revelation a few months ago. Any game that has a scoring track on it somewhere on the board is a race game. Fundamentally, it's a race game. You are racing to get as far up the track or to the end of the track first, and everything else you're doing is just to propel your token on the score track as far as it can. It's a race game in which most of what you're going to be doing and your mental energy is on getting the points and you think that they're tracking the points. No, it's a race game. And doesn't that affect the way you think about the game? Not necessarily. But in terms of designing, in terms of a designer's kind of point of view, and the score track is a comparatively recent innovation. I mean, games like cribbage, you go to a junk shop and there's probably a cribbage scoring board in there somewhere, these things with holes and pegs, and I've never played cribbage. I've no idea how those work. No. But in board game terms, it tracks back to 1986, which is, for many of us, that's, living memory. Was I grown up in 1986? Yeah, I was.
I was busy being born.
Oh, okay. I was. Heimlich & Co. Wolfgang Kramer's, which I may well come back to in a few minutes.
Yes.
Delightful, rather silly game of hidden identities and hidden movement. But it introduces two main things to modern board gaming. It introduces the score track and the meeple. It's one of the very first games to have those flat silhouette wooden counters. They don't look like modern meeples. They're much larger, but they're not the kind of either the abstract pawn type things or the attempt to do a three-dimensional sculpt. They are flat wooden pieces or flat, thick wooden pieces, about the same thickness as modern meeples, actually. And it's just a lovely game. It's a lovely, silly game.
I suppose we should talk about awards, because I believe you just mentioned maybe an award-winning game.
I did, yes.
It's going to be very unlikely that anyone listening to this doesn't know you've written a column for the last 5 years?
Something like that. I wasn't in at the very start of the magazine, but I did start when it was still quarterly, in the very, very early days. And so I think it's over 5 years. It's been a bit of a marathon. It's been great, basically running through the history of the Spiel des Jahres from the first winner, Hare and Tortoise, back in 1979, right up in the latest issue, which I got yesterday. Many thanks for that. Pictures, the very latest winner, and kind of using that as a way of tracking the development of games over the last 42 years, how things have changed, how the industry has changed, how the design styles have changed, how the market and the audience have changed, how the awards changed. It's been a really, really interesting exercise to do. It's also been a fantastic exercise in expanding my games collection massively and making me play some games that normally I probably wouldn't have tackled. There's some stuff on the list that normally just not my usual taste, and a couple of them have turned out to be absolutely brilliant. I was, I'll come on to it later, blown away by Thurnham to Taxis, a minor Spiel des Jahres winner.
Yes.
But a game of the German postal system in the 18th century was never going to set the world alight, and isn't terribly highly regarded. But I just really enjoyed it. Had a really, really good evening with it with a couple of mates, and I've gone back to it a couple of times since.
So obviously this is the Spiel des Jahres. Mm-hmm. I think I'm saying that right. I never. I
think it's Spiel. Having been this.
Oh, is that the bit I've got wrong?
My German is appalling, and I now work for a large European country, and my languages are having to come up to speed really fast. But I was listening to because they live cast the award ceremony. I believe I don't know if it was televised this year. It's certainly been televised in previous years. And they seem to be saying Spiel rather than Spiel. But that may be a regional thing. I have no idea. But anyway, the Game of the Year award awarded in Germany by a panel of German games journalists and commentators, because Germany is the industry and the hobby over there is developed to the stage where you can have full-time journalists and commentators on board games. Been running 42 years. They pick it used to be a single game. These days it's three. There's the Game of the Year, the children's game of the year and the expert or connoisseur's game of the year, the Kennerspiel. Ken, for those who know, the insider's game of the year. It's not necessarily the best game, but certainly it's the most important award in the world, which I've said way too many times in the column. It's not aimed at hobbyists. It's mostly kind of family games. It's the kind of family who might buy 1, 2, 3 games a year. You'll find this interesting. So they about almost 20 years ago, they spun off the hobby game stuff into the Kennerspiel, which is for more of the connoisseurs. Though it's not really. It's not often what we would consider a heavyweight game. Usually, it's stuff that even a reasonably intelligent family could tackle without too much difficulty. Kids would be able to get their heads around it. And the Kids Award, which is actually the first one, it's awarded first in the year. Usually something quite lightweight. There's often a dexterity element, brightly coloured components. They're always fun. They're always very interesting to look at. But there have been a couple of years where what was unarguably the best game of the year did not win. Notably 2002, where Puerto Rico, which for a very long time was the top-rated game on Board Game Geek. And this is before they'd spun off the Kennerspiel. I think as a result of this, they spun off the Kennerspiel. Everyone was just going, it's got to be Puerto Rico. This is a game-changing game. It was one of the first great worker placement games. And there's another game mechanic there that's really come through in the last few years. Or just the concept. Now that we have a name for worker placement, we can start to manipulate the concepts around it. But Puerto Rico didn't win, and a thing called Villa Paletti did. And Villa Paletti is a stacking game. Now, I love stacking games. Genuinely one of my great passions. A good stacking game is just an absolute delight. And Villa Paletti is not one of my favourites by any means. It's a decent stacking game. It's very, very pretty. It's absolutely gorgeous. But the play is a little bit limited. Villa Paletti, for me, is not the game of the year in any year. But in particular, beating Puerto Rico, the jury does make interesting decisions sometimes. I mean, this year, you had 2 of the great heavyweight games designers of the last few years up against it. You had Rainer Knizia's My City, which is a legacy game for families, which is an extraordinary thing, but he makes it work. And that was up against Nova Luna by Uwe Rosenberg, the creator of Patchwork and Agricola again. Noted slightly for heavier games or more hobby-oriented games, and Nova Luna is kind of nodding in that direction. And Pictures by a couple of first-time games designers. And Pictures is an unashamed family game. It's almost in the party game thing where you're trying to replicate photos using a variety of household objects that come in the box, like blocks and shoelaces and things. And Pictures won. And I would say not only is Pictures not the best game of the year, it is not as good a game, not as interesting a game as either of the 2 it was up against. But then I've been a hobby gamer for decades and decades. Pictures was not to my taste, but I have to say it was also not to my family's taste. My kids were quite scathing.
This is like a trend, isn't it? I think something I've identified from the column is that the games that win are getting lighter and lighter.
Yeah.
Almost feels like we should have known. We should have known it was going to be Pictures because it felt like maybe there was two obvious examples it was up against, and then there was a very light, nearly party game, and then there was 2 other games from heavyweights that it seemed too obvious that they were going to win. So we should have known. We should have known they were going to go lighter and even lighter again. Yeah. When I first got into board gaming, the early 2000s, I guess, just seeing you'd sort of identify things, and this is before I knew any mechanical names or categorical names for things. And you say, "Oh, I like German style games," and is this a kind of maybe an attempt for the jury to try and broaden their reach from just being this German award?
I think it could be. I think you're right. I mean, it is an award for games published in the German language, and they do champion German games design. It's only been won by 2 British designers, both in the first 5 years of the award. Americans get a look in from time to time, the French, Belgians, a few others, but a few Americans. But if you look down the list in the last 10 years, it's almost entirely Europeans. The last American, I think, was Quirkle in 2011, Susan McKinley's Ross's kind of abstract Scrabble, which is doing it disservice, but if you want a two-word description. Colt Express, French designer, Codenames, Czech designer, of course. Bruno Cathal, I think he lives in Switzerland, I'm not sure. But otherwise, it's, and Just One, I think, French designers. But other than that, almost entirely German. And most of them published for the first time in Germany. But it's swung back and forth between the traditional Euro-style games, and it was, to a large extent, or partly at least, the Spiel des Jahres that helped to bring Euro games to prominence in the 90s and 2000s, not just to the German audience, but to a global audience as well, because it became a badge of quality. And they did anoint an awful lot of the, what are now regarded as the great tentpole games, the great gateway games: Catan, Carcassonne, Ticket to Ride, Codenames, which of course is much more recent, Dominion as well, Dixit. The games that you play as you're getting into the hobby to understand the scope of it and to understand why it's great as well. They've swung back and forth. You had King Domino in 2017, which is a lot of fun, but it is a kid's game. And then Azul, which is very old school and gorgeous. Then last year it was Just One, which is a party game. It's incredibly light. It's one of those word guessing games, but the twist on it is it's co-op. I have to be nice about it because it's published by another one of the companies in the group that I work for. So I can't be too... It is a really nice game, but it is in no way a hobby game. That's not a criticism, it's just a comment. And I think a lot of people thought that it was going to swing back again, that we were going to, they'd nominated two really good games by two really good designers, and my guess is the jury was split between them, and it ended up going to the third, the compromise candidate, the Theresa May of board game candidates.
Well, that is scary.
We did enjoy it. I'm sorry. It's I can see that for certain people, and some of my friends, their families have really enjoyed it, but it didn't work for us. There's nothing terribly new in there. It's kind of Pictionary with bits and bobs and constraints and a couple of Eurogame style mechanics in there. It's all right.
Yeah. So shall we? I think we're going to try and do a top 5.
Okay. Do you want me to put these in order, or can I just do?
Well, no. Literally, no one's ever committed on this podcast to putting them in any order.
No.
The Tabletop Gaming Game Store is open and dispatching orders worldwide. Visit www.tabletopgaming.co.uk to read the reviews and buy the games directly from us.
Although I do like to make the joke that this is when we come to the last one, I always say, and this is your favourite. It was like, no, absolutely not. But I think we're going to do your top 5 a Spiel des Jahres winners.
Yeah, yes, fantastic. So I'm going to start with the first and the most obvious, Klaus Teuber's Settlers of Catan, now just known as Catan.
Yes.
Which, the Euro game, the game that brought gaming to, I'm not going to say the masses, we're not at the masses just yet, but has sold over 30 million copies, is still a joy. I still love playing it. I bought it when it came out in 1995. I bought the very first English edition from Mayfair Games, which you look back at and it's hideous. It's just badly photoshopped textures, and it's dark brown in an unattractive kind of way. But I took it over to GaelCon in Ireland. I'm not sure if GaelCon still runs, but it was a fantastic local Dublin area convention, maybe about 1,000 people. And I was a guest. Mark Gascoigne, who's now running Aconite for Asmodee, was a guest. I think, was it Jervis Johnson from Games Workshop? could have been Andy Chambers, somebody from Games Workshop, and the editor, I believe it was the editor of Arcane, a future publishing games magazine in the mid-90s, whose name, and I'm deeply sorry if you're listening, completely blanking on. And I produced this thing, and we, as the guests of the convention, basically spent the rest of the convention playing it just over and over again, because everybody's taken all the ideas from Catan and reused them endlessly over the last 20, 25 years. But back then, it felt completely fresh and completely new, and it was combining things in a really interesting way to create new sensations and new ways of enjoying and occupying your mental space. And as we were saying, it's not about what's happening on the board, it's what's happening in the space above the board and between the players. I still really enjoy it. It's still a really good way of introducing people to what is interesting about Euro games. It's a delight, and it has done so much for games as a field as well.
Yeah, this was the second game of this type I played. First being Carcassonne.
Right. Yes.
Yeah, and so I came in sort of, maybe I reverse parked that one, but yeah, it is obviously an absolute joy, and I remember talking to the designer of the Minecraft game from Ravensburger, which I think you reviewed.
I did review. I wasn't keen on it. I mean, it's an okay game. It just doesn't feel like Minecraft.
Yeah. Yes, that was the criticism, and I think it was a pretty good stab at trying together. And he said, because every interview I do with people ends up being, so what do you think of the state of Eurogames by the end of it? And he said, well, I'll tell you that I was at a games night the other week or month or something, and at the end of the night, someone said, should we just have a quick game of Catan? At the end of the night, and he said that he thought that this used to be like a big game for your whole evening, but now for hobby gamers, it's kind of relegated to a palate cleanser. And I think often we forget how good these games are. These just like really solid gateway games that are just good fun to play. They don't take your whole evening, and they just feel good. You know.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. I would just say as a footnote, I love the base game. But if adding in Seafarers, it's just Seafarers for me is the icing on the cake. The two together with the expansion, it makes suddenly wool becomes a useful resource, which it really isn't in the basic game. But I mean, I could argue tedious points on that for ages. But Catan, so that is not necessarily my number one, but it's the first one that comes to mind. The second one is one I've already mentioned, Heimlich & Co., Wolfgang Kramer, in the early 80s, actually 1986. Kramer was coming through, I think it was his first Spiel des Jahres winner. It's a light game. It's a family game. It's a game of, it has a whole bunch of different names. Usually in English it's translated as Top Secret Spies. And the idea is you're trying to, basically, it's a roundel. It's a round track with different houses on, and you roll dice on your turn, and you move some of the pieces on the board that number of spaces, but you don't tell anyone what characters, which of those pieces you are controlling, and which you will score for. And when one of the pieces lands on the safe marker, to get the secret documents, because it has this thin veneer of an espionage theme on it, then everybody scores for the number of the house that they're on, except some of the house numbers are negative in a way that never happens in real life. And it's from that, it's very, very quickly becomes very surprisingly strategic as you're trying to work out what pieces the other players are controlling, and therefore screw them over, while at the same time moving pieces in a way that suggests that you are not, to conceal what card you've got. It can happen when the game comes to an end that you reveal all the pieces and discover that the piece that has won is not actually controlled by any of the players. The game can win the game in just a random kind of way. And I've heard gamers go, well, that's just ridiculous. That's a broken win. No, it's hysterical.
That's
I've never seen that happen and the table not burst out laughing. It's we all disguised who we were so well that nobody won.
Absolutely.
You used to be able to pick it up at Essen for like £6 a copy, and it's lovely. It's a little bit dated, but the core ideas are so clever, and it's fast playing, and no turns take very long. If you're sitting there thinking about stuff, you're playing it entirely wrong. The third one, again, I mentioned before, Thun und Taxis by Andres and Karen Seyfarth, who designed Puerto Rico. I love Ticket to Ride, but I don't actually play it that much. I did actually, when I was doing the article for Ticket to Ride, I realised I'd never actually played pure Ticket to Ride. I'd only ever played Ticket to Ride Europe and others of the spin-offs, and sat down with a couple of mates, and we played the original, and it's really tight. It's a tighter game than Ticket to Ride Europe. And it is really good, but fundamentally it's rummy. It's a set building game rather than again, the board is a marker for your success, rather the majority of the game is going on with the cards. Thun Taxis is kind of Ticket to Ride plus. It's got all of the things that make Ticket to Ride interesting, but there's extra levels of strategy and planning and resource management, and it's really, you read the rules and go, oh god, this is going to be a nightmare, and it's one of those games that just resolves itself in your head really fast, and you work out what you're meant to be doing. It is a shame that it is about the postal system in Germany in the 18th century, which is not enormously appealing, because the game itself is really nice. It is not a lightweight game, but if you have played a bunch of Ticket to Ride and you're after something that's the same but different, and you don't fancy picking up yet another version of Ticket to Ride itself, Thun und Taxis is a really interesting one to hunt down.
I'm at a point where I don't recommend Ticket to Ride to people anymore. I just recommend one of the smaller versions.
No, I think you're right. I think the city versions are really clever. They're a really nice refinement of the basic design.
Super fast. You can maybe have, like, if you're both really on it. If you're doing 2 players, you can do maybe 4 games in an hour, and that's who's heard of that?
Yeah, I have to admit, I do play Ticket to Ride, but I tend to play the digital version simply because it's faster. You were saying you don't recommend Ticket to Ride as the base game to people. I don't. I blow hot and cold on train games. I know I have a lot of friends who are absolutely into the 18XX series. I like them. I admire them, but they're not for me. The train game I come back to is possibly the most obscure Spiel des Jahres winner. And this is not me being hipster games designer. This was one of my gateway games in the early 80s. Railway Rivals by David Watts, a British winner. And I had the 2 games that didn't quite make it into the top 5 are Hare and Tortoise by the other British winner, David Parlett, and Hanabi by Antoine Bowser, which is a glorious cooperative game of constrained communication, almost a forerunner to the mind. Anyway, they didn't make it. Railway Rivals does, because it's joyous. It's not a modern game by any means. It has been out of print in English since 1985. And it has been out of print in the English language since 1985, and that is an absolute tragedy, because it's a British classic, apart from anything else, and it is a hugely fun game. It's a right-on-the-board game. You have this big map of whichever territory you're playing in, and on your turn, you draw a bit more of your railway route on it, based on a dice roll, but... yes, it's very much on the dice. It's a game from the late 70s. People did not regard dice and randomness as a bad thing at that point. I still don't. But the nice mechanic is somebody rolls the dice and then everybody gets that many points to draw a bit more railway. And certain things like tunnels cost a lot more points. So if it's a low roll, you can't build a tunnel or a bridge that round. And you form junctions. And you form this enormous network. And that's the first part of the game. And then when... I can't remember the exact conditions for the cutoff, but then you race trains along the networks that you built. 2 cities are randomly chosen, and anyone who's got part of a network or a part of a network connected and goes, right, I will race for this. And you race for points, but you can also, if you don't have a complete route yourself, or if somebody else has built a slightly faster one, you can use part of their track and pay them for the privilege. So there's a huge push your luck thing there. You're risking some of your points, you know, if you win. The downside is that the racing is literally all on the dice. It's all on rolling 6-sided dice. And that does feel we're back to snakes and ladders a bit. But at the same time, it's enormously exciting. It's hugely fun. It is a little bit primitive by modern standards. It's also quite collectible. It's hard to find English language copies. Games Workshop did a nice box set in the mid-'80s, and that was the last English language edition. It is in need of a redesign or an update anyway, but it ought to be out there. It ought to be in everyone's collections because, like you were saying about the way people treat Catan these days, it's almost a palate cleanser. There's something very pure about the enjoyment of gaming at the heart of Railway Rivals that I think an awful lot of over mechanistic resource management games, you know, you combine X with Y to get Z, and then you use Z to get points. Railway Rivals is you roll some dice and your train goes faster, and that's brilliant. That's 4. So my final one is Tikal, Wolfgang Kramer and Michael Kiesling.
You know, I did not expect that. I was expecting. You know what I was expecting?
What were you expecting?
Azul. I was expecting Azul.
I really like Azul, but I think I almost like some of Pavilion's better.
I see. Okay.
No, there's something about Tikal that I found. I am a Wolfgang Kramer fan. I do think he's really smart, and I mean, Michael Kiesling, his co-designer on Tikal, was the designer of Azul. So you've kind of got the best of both worlds. You've got the kind of the almost abstract, beautiful, crafted mechanics, but then you've also got this exciting, you know, ahead of its time, exploring the Central American jungles to unearth these temples in a way that might not be regarded as PC these days. Though if you go out to places like Costa Rica and Belize, they are literally still discovering these extraordinary ruined temples and cities in some cases buried deep in the jungles. This is an activity that goes on, and you reveal the board as it goes on to discover where things are. You unearth pathways. You build up these ziggurat pyramids. There's so much going on. It's really fun. It's beautifully balanced. Every decision is an interesting decision, but turns don't go too long, so it zips around quite nicely. It's really nicely balanced. It's gorgeous to play, really fun, really involving. And it was the game where I went from admiring Wolfgang Kramer to going, no, this guy is probably my favourite game designer. It's come out again in a modern edition in the last couple of years, and it's the first part of what they call the Masks trilogy, which to my great shame I have not actually played, but I like Tikal so much, and in the original edition if you can get it. Just a really, really a lovely piece of games design and a really lovely game as well. Enjoyable on every level. I find it very difficult to fault Tikal.
That is a cracking list.
Thank you.
I must say.
At some point, I'm going to line up all the Spiel des Jahres winners and photograph them. I still have all 42, and I'm not sure we're going to fit them in the garden, to be honest.
Oh, I mean, hopefully you're going to knock them over like dominoes.
Oh, I have to do that. All right. If only for the picture of all these games falling on pictures at the very end, burying it.
Cracking stuff. Cool. So I suppose we should also, if you have time,
of course.
I suppose we should talk about what you're doing these days.
I have recently. I'm the annoying bloke. I'm annoying on 2 levels. I got a job during lockdown, having been a university lecturer, games consultant, games designer, editor, tabletop gaming columnist. In the middle of lockdown, I started working for Asmodee. I now run Green Board Games, which is Asmodee's only UK-based game design studio. And it's not one that a lot of hobby gamers will have come across, because we publish the Brainbox games, which are not hobby games. They are educational games or quasi-educational games aimed mostly at 3 to 10-year-olds. But they do really well. It's a very strong British brand. Brainbox has been around since 2005. And they were looking for someone to run the studio, and that's me. So, I've now finding myself back at the heart of the British games industry, which is a delight. It has been weird onboarding with a massive company from a shed in South London. I'm going into the office for the first time on Wednesday, and that's going to be really interesting. But we're having a lot of fun. We're doing a lot of interesting stuff. It's just Brainbox for the moment. That's what we're focused on. But I'm hoping that in a year and a half, once the line is stabilized and we've got some cool new releases in the pipeline, then we can start looking at stuff that is, I'm not going to say more hobby games oriented, because Asmodee has so many studios that do hobby games already and do them really well. My reputation in gaming has always been innovation, has always been pushing the envelope of what games can be and what they can do and what they can explore. And we are looking at interesting areas. And educational games have been massively underappreciated for a long time. The idea that we can learn from games. In fact, you do learn from games. Every time you play, you learn mechanics, you learn how to optimize systems. Whether you're thinking about doing that or not, you are. And I think we can take some of that and tweak it a little bit for good, to instill interesting problem-solving techniques, ways of thinking about things, ways of looking at problems. So this is not abstract learning necessarily. This is not about, the dates of the kings and queens, though there's some of that as well, and games are really good at that. This is much more about kind of ways of approaching things, ways of looking at problems, making a better you.
That sounds pretty exciting to me.
I think I really hope it will be.
Yeah, I'd love to ask you, what's your top secret release coming up? But I know you can't. So.
We have a huge top secret release, but I can't tell you because we've not officially announced it yet. It's huge for Brainbox. Again, the hobby gamers are not going to be interested, but retailers are the ones we've told about are salivating.
Excellent. Lovely. Well, is there anything else you'd like to plug before we say goodbye?
I can't think of anything. I don't really have anything out at the moment. One of the things of working for a large company is that it does curtail the amount of work you can, the independent work that you can do. Though I have special dispensation to keep working on the card game I did Once Upon a Time with Andrew Ralston and Richard Lambert. That is still out there. We're still working on expansions for that. And my role-playing game, The Extraordinary Adventures of Baron Munchausen, which I have just got the rights back to. It was out through Fantasy Flight for 3 years, and their edition has just gone out of print. I now have the rights back, and I'm thinking about what to do with that next. And I'm noodling on stuff. I'm noodling on a fantasy role-playing game at the moment. I've no idea what I'm going to do with it. I probably can't publish it, but when you've been hanging around games as long as I have, it's very difficult to just stop thinking about games design. And there's a good chance, the more you think about something in one direction, little bits of it will start filtering off. You go, oh, I could use that on this current project that I'm doing over here.
Thank you very much for joining us today.
It's been fantastic. A really great opportunity to catch up. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Tabletop Gaming Magazine podcast. If you like the podcast, tell a friend, leave a review, or subscribe to the magazine. You can do that at tabletopgaming.co.uk. You can find us on Twitter at tabletopmag, on Instagram at tabletop_gaming_magazine, TikTok at tabletopmag, or on our new YouTube channel, which contains tons of new videos, all from our latest virtual event at Tabletop Gaming Mag. Our music is by Body in the Thames. The song is called Cloud Meetings, and you can pick that up on Body in the Thames at bandcamp.co.uk.